Hello and welcome back to my channel. It's Tina. And today we're talking about one of my favorite things. We are talking about horror novels. And I was really trying to decide what I wanted to say about horror and kind of give you an introduction. So I decided to bring my 10 books that I like to recommend the most in this genre. I often find that when I am doing my best of the year wrap up list, or if I'm talking about mystery and thriller, I sometimes don't include horror novels. They don't always get their own featured spot on my social media. And, I decided to, on this channel, at least give them their own place or a resource where y'all can go to if you want to know what horror books I love. I am somebody that has been reading horror for a while, but I'm not into the really intense stuff, right? I am somebody that loves mystery and thriller. That is my sweet spot. That is where I tend to read a lot. So I would say these horror novels are good for people that maybe have not read horror, haven't delved into it, but really like mystery and thriller. So you're comfortable with things that are a little bit extreme or a little bit intense. These things aren't super, super gory. And I'm actually going to rank them in this video from the least scary to the most scary. Now, I will give you a caveat. I'm actually really bad at deciding what's scary and what's not. It takes a lot to really, really get under my skin. So I'll be sure to let you know which one of these got under my skin in a way that thoroughly creeped me out, because there's definitely some of them. So what exactly is horror? And I love this question. I got it recently on one of my TikTok videos because I called this book a YA horror novel. And then I read the synopsis and realized, is this horror? Is it not? It sounded like horror to me. So I thought I'd delve into that a little bit. And I think it can be something that gets crossover into a lot of genres. So you'll see thrillers that have elements of horror in it. You'll see horror YA, you'll see dystopian. And I think there are so many things that horror does, but it's often sort of hard to understand, like, okay, is this horror or is this not? So I'm going to say that horror books are the ones that really focus on creating the sense of dread. They're amping up the fear. There could be supernatural elements to it. Think ghosts, monsters, vampires, creatures, but there might not be. There might be psychological terror. So you're really in the head of the person that's in the novel. And that is what's scary, because you're not sure what's real. You're not sure what isn't. Is it madness or what's going on here? There's also, in horror novels, situations of extreme danger. So you're really feeling the peril for the characters. I think the goal with horror is to evoke emotion. It's shock, disgust, anxiety, and it really explores these darker aspects of what it means to be human. It's the fear of the unknown, it's the fear of real things. And it's one of these genres that I think I really enjoy because it allows me to feel like I'm having this thrilling or scary experience without actually going through those things myself. Horror is not always this fast paced, in your face thing, though. I think some are better at building atmosphere and building a sense of dread with a little bit of payoff. Some are definitely more in your face. You're scared for the majority of the novel. And I think I have a nice mix here that I'm bringing. Why else do people like to read horror? I think we like that adrenaline. We like that feeling of, your heart's beating. It really, at least for me, sucks me into the reading experience. I think it is a way to safely explore the unknown. It's a way to safely think about, like, what might happen if X, Y, and Z, what might happen if the worst thing or the worst outcome took place. I think some readers like to use horror reading as a way to process grief or process anxiety or process some of those fears that we have, maybe facing their fears head on. I think these novels are often psychologically complex, and at least with my favorite horror novels, there's a protagonist that's really going through something, and I tend to empathize with what they're going through, but then also be really glad that I'm not in their shoes. Now, there are several subgenres of horror. Some I gravitate to more than others. Obviously, it's a very diverse genre, and I'm sure there are many more that I'm going to list here. I should have brought it downstairs because I do have this book. Sadie Hartman, Mother Horror, is a fantastic follow if you don't follow her already. She gets into all things horror, but she came out with a book, I think last year or a couple of years ago. It's called 1001 Ways to Die, I think. I'm actually going to put the cover here so you can look at it. But in it, what she does is breaks down the genre, gives you definitions, gives you a ton of recommendations. So I highly recommend checking this book out if you want to get more into horror. But I'll give you a high level overview of some of the different subgenres of horror. Number one is psychological horror. That's one of my very favorite. I love psychological fiction. I love exploring what's going on in human psyche. I don't mind being in the mind of a killer or a monster or whatever it is. I really, really like that. And in psychological horror, it focuses on the mind, whether that is the mind of the character, it could be, sort of gaslighting, it could potentially be mental illness, but I think the character themselves is really guessing and trying to figure out what it is that's going on. It often deals with themes of insanity, paranoia, and just this overall tension. And a lot of this action, I think, is internal, but you still might get some of that internal thoughts and processing out to play out on the page. You've also got supernatural horror, which is hit or miss for me. Supernatural horror, it incorporates things that are beyond what you would see in the everyday. I think you're going to get your ghosts, your demons, your witches, and it's not necessarily monsters, but they are things that are not of this world. Maybe you've got a little magic involved in supernatural horror. You've got Gothic horror, which horror is or Gothic, I should say, is interesting because what does Gothic mean, right? I think it's one of those words when you hear it, you know what they're referring to. Gothic horror, I have an example of it today. These ones have setting that plays a huge role into the overall atmosphere and feeling of the story. This one could be taking place in an old mansion, in a manor, in a haunted hotel. I also think for Gothic, I'm thinking it's set in previous time periods. So it's set sometime in the 1800s or set in the past. Those are very moody, very atmospheric reads, and they tend not to be as gruesome as some of these other genres. Like slasher horror. Slasher horror, if you watch horror movies, which fun fact, I don't, but slasher horror obviously revolves around a killer or a group of killers that is stalking people that are in the story, typically in gory and violent ways. These are going to be known for being graphic, suspenseful, and there's that final girl trope where, there's one person that survives the slasher and lives to tell the story. Then you've got your monster horror novels. Monster, of course, you've got vampires, werewolves, you've got all of the kind of creepy crawly things, zombies that are featured in, the monstrous world. I don't read a ton of these, right? I'm trying to think of examples that really incorporate that. I would call witches more supernatural. So I do books with witches in them. I do books with ghosts in them, but ghosts or books with straight up monsters or creatures. There's been a few, but I don't have a ton that I recommend. Another subgenre in horror is body horror. And this is I want to say sweet spot, but my God, that sounds creepy. Body horror is when the author uses very graphic description of what's going on to somebody's body to help give that creep and shock factor. I'm thinking decay, I'm thinking serious injury, I'm thinking, maybe it's an accident or even illness. There's some books that are just gross. And as you can see, my reaction sort of visceral, right? It's just this really creepy sort of exploration of the breakdown of people's bodies. And for whatever reason, I'm really attracted to those stories. They are the scariest to me. Finally, there is survival horror. And I don't know if you would call this its own subgenre, but obviously in this one, the characters are trying to survive and live against all odds. And usually there's some sort of dangerous situation. There might be an apocalypse. Maybe it's the end of the world. Maybe it's like a super dangerous setting. These ones, typically in my experience, are more fast paced and more unsettling and sort of this will they, won't they survive? And there's going to be a pretty intense graphic violence in these, but oftentimes a very compelling, heart-pounding story. All right, we're going to rank this stack from least scary to most scary. I'm looking at this stack, and if you read a lot of horror, I don't want to hear you say, well, that one didn't scare me, right? I think fear is subjective, and you never know what it is that someone has gone through that's really going to contribute to whether or not they find a book is scary. So I'm trying to be as objective as I possibly can be with these. These are going to be in the order of least scary to most scary according to what I think the masses might say. There are only a couple of horror novels, I would say maybe 10 ever, that have truly, truly scared me. Some of them are on this list, but I really have to do a deep dive and see what others really, truly scared me. If that's something you're interested in, let me know. I'll do a follow-up video on horror. But first book that I like to recommend to individuals, especially if you're just starting out in horror, is Cackle by Rachel Harrison. Now, I will say, this is the only Rachel Harrison book that I truly recommend, and I've read quite a few from her. I think I've read 3, and I DNF'd another. And Cackle. Is it a spoiler to say there's a witch in it? I don't think so. You get that from the cover, right? It is about Annie. Annie is a woman who just got broken up with and moves from Manhattan to a small town in upstate New York to take a job as a teacher. And when she's there, she is finding that the new town she lives in is the most charming place ever. And she's still kind of lonely though. And then she meets Sophie. Sophie is beautiful. Sophie is charming and for some reason seems to want to be Annie's friend. And they spend a lot of time together. And the more time they spend together, Annie starts to feel like, okay, something is up. Things are different when she is around Sophie. She seems ageless. She lives in this gorgeous, huge mansion. And could she be a witch? Is that possible? And then you explore that throughout this story. I really enjoyed this book. I liked the character of Sophie a lot. She is kind of this take no shit type of character. And I really appreciated that. Annie, is one of those characters that you're just like, come on, girl, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. But I think this one is cozy. There's just enough horror elements in it. There's a magical spider, if memory serves, but I think this one is really kind of sweet and a little bit funny. So I would recommend this. This one would fall in the paranormal horror category. Next up is The Weight of Blood by Tiffany D. Jackson. Tiffany D. Jackson is an author I've read a lot of. She is a favorite. And this is my favorite book of hers, actually. So The Weight of Blood is heavily influenced by Stephen King's Carrie, as you might guess from this cover. I don't know what's on my cover, though. It's like tripping me out. It's kind of gross. All right. The Weight of Blood is about this small town in Georgia that hosts its first integrated prom. And this is in present day. And as you can imagine, or maybe you can't imagine, but maybe you wouldn't be surprised to know that there are a lot of people that are not happy that this is an integrated prom. And she really tackles a lot in this. It talks on the history of racism in America. This one is technically, though, a YA novel, so they are set in high school. And what's so interesting about this is that it is told sort of from the point of view of a podcast. So you know that there was something really bad that happened that prom night, but you don't exactly know what it was that happened. And so this book is interviewing a lot of people. The main character is Madison. She is biracial, but she has been passing, meaning she has been acting as though she's white for a long time, because she has a father that's super racist. But then a viral video exposes her and people start to bully her for this. She gets asked to prom by the high school quarterback who is black. And she starts to wonder, like, okay, are things looking up for me? But Maddie has another secret that I will let you uncover as you read this. Highly recommend the audiobook for this. It's a full cast narration. It's really, really good. And even though it's technically a YA horror novel, it reads adult. It doesn't read too silly or campy. And you will get the Stephen King inspiration from this. Highly recommend. I think this one's a great one. Not scary, but there are elements that are in the horror genre. The next one is Slewfoot by Brom. Number 1, we love this cover, right? So good. And this one is set in colonial New England. It is a tale of magic and mystery, and it's about a young English woman, Abitha, who arrives at a Puritan colony. She is betrothed to a man she doesn't know all that well, but quickly becomes widowed after her husband dies under mysterious circumstances. So she inherits this farm, but that is totally against what people want. They're very pious and very puritanical. And so the fact that she's living on her own and doing a lot of farming does not sit well with the people in her community. Then she runs into this character called Slewfoot, and it seems like they're trying to help her out, but because she is interacting with this thing, people are starting to accuse her of being a witch. And you get these awesome drawings as well if you get the physical version. So this is the vibes. This is what you can see. Samson's a character in it. And, I think this one is really interesting. That Slewfoot there. This one is really interesting. Very vibey. This one is folk horror, a little bit gothic feeling, but I enjoyed it. I don't know that this was my number one favorite book, but I do like to recommend it because I think it does a lot of interesting things. It almost reads a little bit like historical fiction because you're getting these elements of colonial New England, and there's lightly spooks and scares, but it's not so scary that you'll be staying up all night. Next up is The Hunger by Alma Katsu. This one is historical horror, a subgenre of horror that I did not mention, but I really, really love. This one's so interesting. It's actually a reimagining of the Donner Party with a supernatural twist. So if you're not familiar, the Donner Party is this group of individuals that went to travel west from the Midwest during the gold rush, and they made some choices that really were catastrophic for their group, and it ended up that they had to be stranded in very unfavorable conditions for several days, and most of their party died. I'll leave it at that. But this one takes a different turn on that, and she gives it this supernatural element. What I love about this one is she talks about real people. So her influence is by the real Donner Party, the real people that went through it. And it's set in the mid 1800s. I like the characters a lot in this one, particularly the female characters. I think her name was Tamsin. I loved her. And I like that she used a lot of real life letters, what I imagine are real letters, to help tell this story. And, instead of just the elements that are the things that cause this party to devolve, it's supernatural elements too. So I think this one's a great time. Pick it up. Next is The September House by Carissa Orlando. I loved this book so much. This is a debut, and I can't wait for more by this author. It is about Margaret and Hal, who bought this large Victorian home that they are obsessed with, right? It's their dream home. They're super happy that they got it. They're happy that they were able to get it for a reasonable price. But the house is haunted, but like literally haunted. It's not, what is it or isn't it? The walls are dripping blood. But the thing is, it's only haunted 1 month a year. And Margaret's like, you know what? I'm not leaving. This is my dream home. It's only 1 month a year. I can handle it. But then Hal disappears. Something happens to Hal and we don't know what it is. And they do have a daughter, and the daughter keeps hitting her mom up like, hey, what's going on? Let me come over. Where's dad? And as the daughter comes in, the hauntings become more and more harrowing. I love this book. The author is a psychologist, and I think she does, I don't want to say any more than that, but she uses her knowledge of psychology really, really well in this book. I love the main character, Margaret. I was rooting for her. You get a lot of interesting side characters, some great reveals, and I can't say enough about this. Highly recommend. Now, this next one I almost didn't bring to this video because I'm like, is it horror or is it not? But I'm going to bring it anyway. It's The Good Son by Yu Jong. And I mean, you can tell sort of what the vibe is that you're getting. And I say I don't know if this is necessarily a horror novel because technically you could make the argument that it's a thriller. The main character, Ju Win, wakes up one morning with a metallic smell in his nose. He gets a phone call from his brother asking if everything is all right because he got a call from their mother in the middle of the night. And so Eugen's like, yeah, everything's fine. I'm at the house, whatever. He leaves his room and goes into their main area, their living room, and finds that their mom is lying in a pool of blood at the bottom of the stairs in their house. And he cannot remember much about the night before. He doesn't know what happened, and he actually has memory problems. So this is a book where you've got a main character that has a lot of memory issues, but for him it's caused by seizures, and he has this impression that he had something to do with it. He gets these glimpses of his mom calling his name, but was she asking for help or did he do something? And then the book follows this 3-day journey of Eugen trying to figure out what happened to their mom. This one is twisty. This one devolves pretty quickly. I would call this pretty firmly into the psychological horror genre, but overall, I think this one is a really taut story. It's one that will make you think. It's one that will have you questioning everything, and it's also a story about the relationship between a mother and son. Nestlings is next, and this one is a wild ride. This one there's a lot to it, right? It's got this couple, Anna and Reed, and they are in desperate need of a lucky break because they just had a baby, and unfortunately, the birth left Anna paraplegic. So they're really dealing with that. She's trying to relearn her body in postpartum, and now no longer has the ability to walk. and they enter their names into a New York lottery. They put their names in to live in this apartment complex called the Deptford, one of Manhattan's most revered buildings, and they actually get it. So they're like, okay, things are starting to turn around. It's wheelchair friendly, and they feel like this will be a really good place to raise their daughter. But then once they get there, things are disturbing. They've got interesting neighbors. Their daughter starts acting in really strange ways, even though she's a baby, and the horrors devolve from there. I can't believe a man wrote this because he wrote motherhood so well. Motherhood, early days of postpartum can be a horror in and of itself, and he did such a good job with really unpacking that. I don't want to say much more than this though, because there are other elements that come into play and I don't want to ruin it, but there's so many good reveals in this one. Highly recommend. I did this one on audio and I think it's great. Nat Cassidy is one of my favorite authors in horror. I did not like Mary. I might try it again. I DNF'd that, but I loved his novella Rest Stop. That one, talk about disgusting. I will never go into a rest stop bathroom ever again after reading that one. I recommend that and this book. Another book that I love to recommend is A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay. And I read this one a long time ago. It came out in 2015. And I want to say I read it just about then. I think this one is very accessible because it tells the story of this family, the Barretts. They're a normal suburban family, and they're torn apart when their 14-year-old daughter displays signs of schizophrenia. And they are not able to stop the daughter's descent into madness. And you're sort of wondering, okay, is this mental illness or is something more going on? And then they bring in a priest to do an exorcist. And that's creepy enough. The story, though, has a really interesting way of being told. It is told via interviews because it's now, I think, like 20 years later, and a writer is investigating what happened to Marjorie, and she is interviewing the sister who is telling the story. And they're sort of making this reality. Wait a minute. Now that I'm thinking about it, the reality TV tie-in was back in the day because they brought the production company in to really help figure out what was going on with the daughter. And now it's 15 years later, and the writer is trying to get the sister to tell the story of what happened to her sister. Anyway, I really like that element. Sometimes books with reality TV tie-ins are not my favorite, but I think this one did really well. This is psychological horror. There might be something more to it. There is one scene that I literally will never forget. It's body horror. I'll leave it at that. And I think this one was creepy. This is my favorite Paul Tremblay book, and I've read a couple others from him, but this is my top recommendation. Next is The Ruins by Scott Smith. I read this one last year. It was I think my favorite or my second favorite horror novel that I read last year. This one is body horror. There's some other elements as well, but again, I don't want to ruin anything, but it is about two couples that are on a lazy Mexican vacation. They're drinking, they're enjoying their days in between college and going to med school, and they're making friends with some fellow tourists. And when the brother of one of those tourists or people that they've made friends with disappears, the guy begs these couples to go with him to try and find his brother. And so they're like, whatever, sure, let's do it. Now, you have to suspend your disbelief with this one because these 5 people make the dumbest decisions you've ever read in print. But I loved it. College kids are dumb. I can attest to that. I remember I was a college kid and I'm always thankful that I made it out alive. And this is a story of what happens when the worst case scenario comes to life. It is terrifying. Tons of body horror. I love this book so much. Scott Smith is not afraid to go there. This book is gory in parts, and I love that there is a pretty solid explanation as to why things are the way they are. I would say, though, this one is not for the faint of heart, but I found this to be such a page turner. All right, I only have 2 left, so we're getting really into the horrific, and this next one is The Troop by Nick Cutter. The Troop is so effing disgusting. I can't express it enough. It is about a troop of, we'll say, Boy Scouts, and their scoutmaster leads these boys into the Canadian wilderness, and they're going to do things like tell stories, investigate, and, whatever, enjoy the great outdoors. But then an unexpected intruder stumbles upon their campsite, and this person is off. He's shockingly thin, he's disturbingly pale, he's super hungry, and the scoutmaster and the boys have to decide what they're going to do. Are they going to help this guy? Are they not? And it turns out what's going on with this person is going to affect them all. I don't even want to be holding this book. It's so disgusting. Oh my God. And there's something gross on my book too, which just really adds to the overall creep factor of this book. I loved it. I mean, I gave this book 5 stars. It's disgusting. If you like a pandemic or if you like books about illnesses, I think this one should really be on your list. Finally, the most disturbing book that I have on this list is Tender is the Flesh by Augustina Bazterrica. And I don't know what to say. This book is about eating human flesh. Okay. So Marcos is the main character. I'm laughing. This book is really effed up. Marcos works at the local processing plant. He is a manager, and the plant is in the business of slaughtering humans because animal meat has become unfit for humans to consume. So they are now bioengineering and raising humans for food. And no one calls them humans anymore. I actually forget the word that they call them. They just call it special meat. And Marcos just really tries to put it aside. He's like, you know what? I'm just here to process numbers. I'm just here. And he works there because his dad has dementia and he's trying to support him and he's trying to just stay alive. And then one day, for a job well done, he is given a gift, a live specimen that is a human. And he is aware that personal contact is forbidden. He's supposed to process this person and eat their flesh. He starts to treat her like a human being and things go really, really wrong. This book, man, okay. There's a great reveal in the very back of it. Like, I can't say enough about this. It creeped me out. It made me not want to eat meat for a while. However, be aware there's animal cruelty in here and it's pretty egregious. So just know that. Still, I really recommend this one. I think this author did such a good job. It's a short novel too. If you think you can stomach it, I would say pick it up. What did I highlight? God only knows. That's right. I forgot that Marcos, is processing grief in this novel. So that gives you a little bit more explanation as to why he works at this plant. I don't know, read this or don't. If you hate it, I'm sorry, but I think this one is really interesting. Obviously, for all of these, check the content warnings. I don't know what would trigger you. These are disturbing books, and if you're not sure, definitely check the content warnings on Storygraph first to see if this might be something you want to read. All right, so that's the full list. These are some of the books that I love to recommend to anybody, whether or not they are seasoned horror readers. But again, I think if you want to dip your toe into horror, start slow, start on the lower end of the spectrum, and maybe work your way up to some of the more gruesome things. But let me know in the comments, what's your favorite horror novel? Do we have any in common on this list? Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'd love to see you back here. And until next time, bye.